Good evening, everyone. My name is Dave Wattles. I'm the black bear biologist for the state of Massachusetts. I work for the Division of Fish and Wildlife. I'm going to be talking to you. You're not quite yet in black bear range here, but they are moving this way. And your hobby, your activity, definitely is a target for bears. So I'm going to try to prevent damage and conflict that you could potentially experience when bears do arrive. I'm going to start with just some general life history of bears so you kind of know what we're talking about here. Bears are born in the den in January. They remain with the mother for the first year. They den with her again that next winter as yearlings, and then disperse the following spring. So right now we're approaching the tail end of their breeding season, and it's just before that, in April and May, that the young bears are dispersing. So females don't disperse very far. They tend to use a portion of their mother's home range. But the male bears disperse widely. And these are the guys that you guys are going to be experiencing and dealing with first off. For example, a bear from Worcester could easily end up here. A bear from Worcester could end up in New Hampshire, Connecticut, New York. The young males can disperse quite a long ways. Adult males are solitary. Females tend to be about 225 pounds when they're full grown. We've had a single female bear that's cracked 300 pounds, but she was a heavy cornfield feeder, and to say she was obese was being quite kind to her. But males are a different story entirely. They can easily be 450, 500 pounds, so a very large animal. Bears are omnivorous, so they eat both plants and meat matter, but plant material makes up the vast majority of their diet. But basically, a bear will eat just about anything. They are in reality a walking stomach. That's why you guys are a target for them. In spring, it's really the first vegetation that is the bulk of their diet. So things with tuberous roots like skunk cabbage are very important. A lot of the first emergent vegetation in wetlands is what they key in on in the spring. They'll also eat leftover nuts, acorns, beech nuts, hickory nuts from the previous year, and will opportunistically feed on deer fawns when they encounter them. Throughout the year, the habitats that they use, so the forest, the wetlands, the different places they're using, is dominated by where they're going to find food. So in the spring, it tends to be in wetlands where skunk cabbage and other vegetation like that is emerging. But food is scarce in spring, so this can be a time where we see a lot of conflict because they are heavily reliant on human-associated foods or will take advantage of human-associated foods, the big one being bird feeders, but you can also see a lot of damage on your hives at that time of year. As the seasons change, bears' diet will change as different foods become available. So in summer, as this is where you are right a part of their natural food. Ant nests, bees and wasp nests, ground hornets, beetle larvae are all part of their natural diet that they're transitioning to as those animals become more active. Then they'll switch to different berries, so blueberries, raspberries, cherries as they can become available, corn and apples as they ripen later in the summer. And so again, the habitats that they use are driven by where they can find those foods. So upland forests, lawn areas where there tends to be both a lot of ants as well as a lot of berries, wetlands, and then fields and orchards. In fall, they kick into what's called hyperphagia. This is where they go into a real compulsion to just eat as much as they can and gain as much weight as they possibly can. Still relying on corns and apples this time of year, so farmers, orchards can experience quite a lot of damage from bears in the fall. But the main portion of their diet is hard mass, so acorns, hickory nuts, beech nuts where they're available in the state, and they will take advantage of deer carcasses as well. So everyone's pretty familiar with the fact that bears hibernate in the winter. They do so not because it's too cold for them to be out. They're just as capable as a coyote, a fisher, a fox to be out throughout the winter. It's because there's not food available for them. An animal is that large and relies heavily on vegetation, there's essentially no food for them in the winter. So as a result of that, they have to gain all the weight they need to survive, all the energy they need to survive for the year, they have to gain in 7 to 8 months when they're active. As a result, they're evolutionarily, physiologically adapted to search for calorie-rich foods. And your beehives are one of those very calorie-rich foods. And unfortunately, from my perspective, in dealing with bear conflict, people readily supply bears a lot of food. The worst case is bird feeders, but unsecured garbage, people who don't protect their bees, don't protect their chickens and livestock. All those things are potential food sources for bears, and that leads to conflict. Because bears are going to take advantage of those easy, quick meals at all times. Again, they need to gain as much food as they possibly can, and so quick, easy meals are what they are going to take advantage of. And this is where we have conflict with bears in the state. And most of the time, this isn't a bear problem, it's a people problem. Not taking responsibility for the foods they're providing to wildlife. So our bear population in Massachusetts is expanding. We are essentially recovering from post-colonial times. There used to be bears throughout this portion of the state, right into Boston and everywhere, but basically when colonists came, they cut down all the forest and converted it to farmland, and essentially they shot bears for both meat and as competitors. So we basically drove our bear population back to just a small remnant population in the northern Berkshires. So it's increasing and it's also expanding to the eastward. And there is a lot of very suitable habitat in eastern Mass for bear to move into, including down in this portion of the state. So to kind of capture this is essentially one of the best ways to monitor the growth of our population is through looking at our records of our bear hunting seasons. So when we first had bear hunting, it was concentrated where we had bears, in the northern Berkshires with relatively few animals taken. 10 years later, the bear population is spread throughout western Mass, north of the Pike, but still west of the Connecticut River, eventually spreading through western Mass, getting down into Connecticut. But you can also see a lot more bear taken on an annual basis. So densities of bears are increasing in this area as they're expanding their range there. Eventually, probably in the early 2000s, they crossed the Connecticut River and now have been expanding east. And you can see now we're even getting bears taken in our hunting seasons over here, where Worcester is right about here. So we're now getting that same pattern that we saw in western Mass is occurring in central Mass. So if you look at our historic bear harvest, you can kind of see this reflects the longer amount of time and the higher densities of bears we have west of the Connecticut River. But you can now see that we are taking bears along the leading edge of our range. In that in this area, the bears are definitely, the number of bears are increasing relatively rapidly at this point. So the environmental police have to record every single phone call that comes into them because they're a law enforcement agency. So this is a pretty good depiction of where we have bear reports in the state. This reflects the Cape Bear. So just a single bear can leave a trail of reports across the state. But all these yellow dots are phone calls that I personally took last year. So bears between 495 and 95. And basically once you cross 95, you are in Boston at that point. We moved the bear out of Newton already this year. Last year there were beehives hit in Weston, in Hopkinton, Berlin. So even the few bears in those areas can cause a lot of conflict with beekeepers. And so this is essentially our bear range in Massachusetts now. This darker green here is where we have established bears, and resident females. We have active reproduction occurring in these areas. In this hatched area, which also can extend, we had a bear in Rentham earlier this year, so it is extending again further your direction here. Is typically young males. Males that can't compete with the larger dominant males in the established range, so they tend to disperse into areas where they don't have to compete. But they are now resident east of 495. And there probably are some reproductive females in this area as well. We just don't have reports of them. And once you get a female established in there, the population begins to increase much more rapidly. So bears are coming your way. They're not quite here yet, but they're on their way. But to give you an idea of what it means, a lot of times people who don't live with bears on a regular basis, if a bear's in town, it means lock down the schools. This is a panic situation. So this is the Connecticut River, Interstate 91 here, the city of Northampton, UMass, the main campus of UMass Amherst is right here. Obviously the Quabbin, Springfield is right down here. I'm going to put the data from our collared bears on here, and this is only the bears that we have collared. This is 95% females, so we only have 2 or 3 males here. We don't have many young animals, and this is only the females we have captured. So this is probably a third or less, a quarter or less of the bears using this area. And you can see the city of Northampton disappears under that data. And so this is bears using these areas next to schools, in neighborhoods, in houses. So this is just to get you the idea, once you have a bear living in town, it's living in town. And that they can use just, small blocks of forest in and amongst the development here and take advantage of it. You'll see bears down in here that despite high levels of development, they can do just fine in there. So there's certainly plenty of forest here that if bears make it this way, they can do just fine. And so think about it, if you're living in this area and you have unprotected beehives, you're going to have a bear causing you damage eventually. Yep.
What are the different colors there?
So each one of these is, so this yellow here would be one individual.
Okay.
So this red would be another individual.
Okay.
There's a couple, so here's another yellow, those are 2 different individuals there. So this is just to give you an idea again, what it means to have bears living amongst you. A different perspective, again, so this is UMass Amherst right here. But again, you can just see small forest fragments around with development, apartment complexes and things. And that's how the bear uses that area. So it takes advantage of those small forest fragments to then get in and amongst the neighborhoods in agriculture. Interstate 91, this is Hatfield here. So the bears here heavily use these oxbow wetlands from the Connecticut River. Again, to be right in and amongst town. This bear regularly crosses Route 91. So once they get to a certain age, they can figure out how to navigate those highways. Yep.
What is the definition of bear use? Is it just one sighting?
So, I should explain. So this is data from our GPS collars. So each one of these dots is a location that's been recorded on her collar. So basically every 45 minutes, the collars are programmed to take a GPS location. So that would be this dot here. 45 minutes later, it's going to take this dot. So this is over a period of a year or two, all the different locations that this one female has used.
All those yellow dots is one bear.
Yes.
She gets around.
That's just the color one. Yeah,
And just one individual.
And they don't move as much as the male.
Right. So this is now looking down into the city of Northampton here, and you're going to have 2 bears here. Again, so each one of these is a different one. This green bear's, one of her favorite habitat patches was a small, dense wetland right next to the parking lot to the Cooley Dixon, the main hospital in Northampton. And she'd spend all day there and then go wander the neighborhoods at night. So again, city of about 20 to 30,000 people, and there are a lot of bears in Northampton, believe me.
What are they feeding on?
A lot of bird feeders. Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. But it's unfortunately it's a lot of bird feeders. And so I think you can tell from this that bears can easily take advantage of this type of habitat configuration. And we have this all over Massachusetts, where we've done a good job of conserving forest and wetland habitats, but we also have housing developments in neighborhoods intermingling with and interspersing with a lot of that natural habitat. So when you're living in here, you have to realize that you're living with all the wildlife that's using that forest as well. And so it's my job to convince people that think that they're living here, that it's white picket fences, picnic in the backyard, but it's also very much this. And the actions that you take around your homes depend on how much it's this versus this. So as a manager, my goal is to have healthy bear populations on the landscape, healthy populations of all our wildlife. That's what our agency is striving for. But we want them feeding on natural foods and using in natural areas and living compatibly with the human population. So that's kind of our goals for all our wildlife species. So I want bears feeding on acorns and blueberries and raspberries and ants, not at your bird feeders. Human-bear conflict comes in when bears are given human food sources. because they're going to take advantage of those all year round. This is the bane of my existence, bird feeders. Unfortunately, bears are drawn to neighborhoods and backyards because of bird feeders. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's not a bird feeder, it's a wildlife feeder. So whether it's the bear, it's a coyote, it's anything else, the squirrels that everyone hates when they're on their bird feeders, you're drawing them in. And if you're a bear and you can eat 5 pounds of birdseed in one sitting versus pick up a few acorns or blueberries at a time, you're going to go to that birdseed time and time again. And when Mrs. Johnson goes out and fills it as soon as you empty it, what are you going to do? You're going to go back to that same spot time and time and time again. And so we get tons and tons of pictures like this, and I get a lot of phone calls like this. This was actually to our Connecticut Valley district manager, where send him this picture and say, do something about your bear. So do something about your bird
This
feeder.
looks like a commercial for bird feeders, not by a bear.
Yeah, right. So in reality, this is happening all over the state, but from your perspective, this is a bad thing because this is training bears to come to backyards where they're more likely to encounter your hives. Each time the bear gets that food reward, it's training it to not feed in the forest, but to feed in a yard, to feed in a neighborhood, and that's the best place to find food, find an easy meal. They learn where those are, and they will be back. It might not be the next day. It could be a week later, a month later, the next year, but we see from that data that they return to those spots over and over again. And there's nothing that we can do to solve the bear problem if those bird feeders aren't removed. Number two, yep.
How big is the bird feed industry?
It is millions of dollars. Have you been in a hardware store lately where there hasn't been, bag upon bag of birdseed? It's a huge industry. There's no question about that.
Bear food.
Yeah, no, it is. It's just wildlife food. But I mean, it's in every grocery store, every Walmart, every hardware store. There's birdseed everywhere, and we put it out by the absolute ton in this state every year.
It's even in feed stores.
Yep. So bears definitely see garbage as another high calorie, and it's for a bear that can smell something from miles away. If you've got stinky garbage, that bear's coming there. So we ask everyone to secure their garbage, keep it in a garage, a shed, somewhere, a closed building where they can't access it. Put it out the morning of pickup, not the night before, the day before. You see people who put it out there, and invariably the garbage is strewn halfway down the street. Not always from a bear, but from a raccoon, a coyote, what have you.
I love her designer necklace there.
Yep. And so, again, we know from our collared animals that they're doing this. A little bit of tracking, and you can catch them in the act of doing a lot of naughty things.
Fake news, that's an actor bear.
That's right. This is all staged. It's tough to train her to do that. Dumpsters are another big issue for a couple of reasons. We have a lot of problems at group living facilities with dumpsters. You've got a lot of different people coming to that dumpster, so you could have 100 people all putting their garbage in there, visiting regularly. If a bear is coming to that dumpster as well, and it's regularly in there for food, the chances of a bear coming in direct contact with a person are relatively high. So it's important that dumpsters be secured so bears can access the food. Because fortunately, black bears aren't inherently aggressive towards people. We'd be having a very different conversation tonight if this was a brown bear and that if they were inherently aggressive towards people. Where people tend to get hurt is where they surprise a bear. They're going out to the trash the same time the bear is in there. They're letting the dog out the sliding glass door when it's on their bird feeder. It's that direct negative contact or encounter where you have the potential for someone to be seriously injured.
Do beer bells work?
They can on trails because it's one of those things that as you're walking down a trail, it's going to make some noise. So it prevents you from surprising that animal. So it hears you from further off. So it can be something when you're walking down a trail. And I'm not kidding, when I say that this, the garbage can that's left outside, the bird feeder, that's the one and only reason why that bear is in the yard there. Unfortunately, if she's a backyard feeder, she's teaching her cubs that as soon as they come out of the den. So she's going there to feed at that bird feeder, and she's training them from a very young age that that's the best place to find food. So a little over a year later, when this bear's on its own, is it going to go to the forest to find food? No, it's going to be in the yards, and it's going to be in the neighborhoods, and it's a teenager. So what's it going to do? It's going to get into a lot of trouble. It's going to push the boundaries. And unfortunately, the more time they spend feeding at bird feeders and things, then they'll smell, oh, you're screened in porch. You've got something in there. You're storing your bird seed in there. They'll enter the screened in porch. They'll break into a garage or shed. So unfortunately, the more time they spend around houses, the boldness tends to increase with time. And again, this is what we're trying to prevent. This is why we don't want people feeding bears, because we don't want them in backyards, because we don't want someone to be hurt by bears. We've been fortunate in Massachusetts. We've had 6 people who bears have made contact with. They've all been very, very minor injuries, just a quick scrape. But there have been people on the East Coast that have been seriously hurt by bears and even killed by bears in the last several years. So public education, we've got a bear-specific page, so it's a really easy one, mass.gov/bears, takes you directly to our bear page where we've got a lot of the same information I'm giving you here about how to live with bears. My predecessor put together a great video to not feed bears and basically talking about these same issues. And remember, this is our goal in Mass, so we need your help, the public's help, to make sure we achieve that. So now on to what you guys want to talk about, bears and beehives. We're gonna talk about beehives for the most part, but I need to also talk about chicken coops. Hobby chicken farming has increased drastically over the last number of years, and so bears are encountering chicken coops far more often than they used to. And so everything I say about electric fencing for your beehives, if you have chickens, it goes for that as well. If you know folks that participate in any of these activities, it's going to go for them as well. Because as soon as a bear starts raiding chicken coops, it's going to do it habitually, or raiding livestock or beehives. Once it learns that behavior and that that's an easy food, unfortunately, it tends to become a serial raider of those types of foods. And a lot of property damage occurs, and the bear ends up dead. So there is a law in Massachusetts that allows you to kill an animal that you catch in the act of causing property damage. So if you go out there and you see a bear smashing your beehives, you do have the ability to kill that animal.
Can I say something?
Yep.
You better not wound
Yes.
him. I would say don't wound him.
Shoot, shovel, and shut up. But anyway, you actually can shoot within an illegal limit of a home if something is in the act of causing you damage.
I disagree with you.
Okay.
So I was going to
Why
get
do
to
you think I
that.
said it?
So there is. So I'll get to that in just one second. So you cannot indiscriminately kill bears on your property. So again, you can't just shoot a bear that's wandering across the back 40 because you're afraid it's going to hit your beehives. It is caught in the act. So this is discharge setbacks. So you cannot discharge a firearm within 500 feet of an occupied dwelling or 150 feet of a paved road. If you get permission from your neighbors, then that 500 feet setback can be relaxed. The law that allows you to shoot within those discharge setbacks is a different law, and it's in defense of life and property.
You can shoot from your living room window.
Life. So if the bear is in your living room, shoot it. And worry about the discharge setbacks later. But I don't believe they apply in that situation. I know you'll get in trouble.
I'll defer to your judgment.
Okay.
That includes our arrows, so.
That may be a gray area, actually.
Yeah.
So you're not hunting. It does apply in hunting that you can't hunt with a bow and arrow within those. So bow and arrow may be a little bit of a gray area.
Samurai swords?
A lot of times,
If you shoot an animal, the issuing officer of the police department that issues your FID card and or your pistol permit, they can call you unfit and they can take it. So even if you don't get charged, you can lose your right to have a firearm within the state of
So, I mean, in most circumstances, and particularly out in this area where you do have much higher housing densities, unfortunately, there aren't many places that you can exercise these rights legally. And if you ever are thinking of doing so, I highly recommend you call us, you call the environmental police, and you call your local police. Because if you do it, it's better off to let them know that you're having this issue, so you don't get, either your guns taken away or you don't get charged with something even worse. After the fact. So if you do kill a bear, you have to report it to the environmental police and to us. We get to determine what happens with the carcass. You don't necessarily get to keep the bear. We don't want to provide motivation for anyone to be shooting bears. Just for
Don't want to
sake.
tie your wife out to a tree to attract
Attract a bear.
That was a bear rug,
What?
a bear rug.
Yep. But I don't want to provide you motivation to shoot that bear and think you can take a rug outside of the hunting season, so you might not get that bear.
It's roadkill.
And you also have to remember that doesn't solve the problem. You know, you saw the number of bears living in that area. Shooting that one bear, if your beehives aren't protected or your chicken coops or whatever, you haven't solved the problem at all. So until you take responsibility, remove all the food sources, use electric fencing, and try to proactively solve the problem, we really don't want you exercising your Section 37 rights because it doesn't solve the problem. It may solve the immediate problem, but the next bear is going to be back and it's going to do the same thing.
So does an electric fence that a farmer would use for his cows, you know, it gives a zap every, second or two? Is that zap? That's.
Yep, and so I'm going to go through in great detail the electric fencing in a second here. Sorry. So we're at the electric fencing. So it really is an essential tool. It is really the only thing. You can't build a fence, a shed, or whatever strong enough to protect from bears. They can crack a chicken coop like it's an egg. It's really an essential tool. It has to be baited. We highly recommend it's baited anyways to make it effective, and it has to be maintained and well built.
What does baited mean?
I'll talk about that in a second, but it's basically trying to attract the bears directly to the wires rather than them just brushing the wires against their chest. So we had an old sheet that was just basically making some general recommendations about using electric fencing, but I just completed an electric fencing guide for protecting. It's a step-by-step instructions. It has materials, a couple different systems to set up that provides all the steps, everything you need to know about setting up electric fencing. You can also either call me in Westborough or your district office, and they can help you with setting that up as well, provide recommendations to how to do so. But this is available right on our website, so go to our Bear page and just search Electric Fencing Guide, and that'll come up. It's a PDF, you can download it. Is it really necessary to fence your apiary?
Yeah.
I think if you came out to that one morning, that would answer the question for you pretty quickly. I think you're all well aware of what the cost of that would be, both in monetary, but also the time and effort you put into raising your bees. A single outing with a bear can cause a lot of damage for you. Is it important to have a properly set up and maintained electrical fence? You know, if you just put up electric fence and say, I've got a fence, a bear can get through it. You really need to build a good fence that's not going to allow a bear to step over, step through, what have you, and destroy your hives, even though you, in name, have electric fencing there.
So that was a picture of a fence that was electrified?
Yep,
and the
so
bears
that's
were
electric fencing there, but that's a smashed beehive on the inside. Pounds. If you just have some flimsy fence out there, it's not going to keep them out. You really need to be designing to keep a bear out. So we'll talk about a couple types of designs, but this is definitely what we recommend, where you use actual hog panels there. But again, you're trying to design a fence that's going to adequately protect your hives. So electric fencings have several basic components. The energizer or charger, that's what's actually putting out the electrical charge. Your posts and insulators, the wire, and the grounding rod. That is essentially what your electric fencing is. It's not rocket science. It's relatively simple and easy for you to be able to set up. A charger or voltmeter is also very important to make sure that it is working properly and putting out the adequate charge. And then bait, signs, ribbon, other things that we'll get into in a minute. So the fence charger, you want to be putting out 5,000 to 6,000 volts of energy. And it's generally, the output is generally measured in joules. So 0.7 to 1 joule is what for, if you just have 3 or 4 hives there, that's what you're going to use. If you've got a really extensive bee yard with lots and lots of hives that you then take across the state, you're going to want a larger charger for something like that. Yep.
Is that enough energy to zap weeds so it doesn't short out?
No, so we'll talk about that in a
Okay,
minute.
sorry.
So these things don't have a constant charge, and so you'll probably have questions. I always get questions about whether they're safe. There's not constantly charge going through there. It's being pulsed through. So that allows you touch it, you definitely get a good shock that you'll know about it, but it doesn't kind of hold you there. It doesn't trap you there. So it is safe for dogs, for children. Your dog won't touch it more than once, but it's not going to hurt it in any way. You can either have AC power, so plug it right into an outlet. That is certainly the most reliable source of energy. If you have it available to you, you can run an extension cord and make sure it's waterproof, but that's the most reliable. Or you can use a battery and solar power. If you're using batteries, they have to be recharged. You have to make sure they're charged at all times. So if you don't have solar charger, you're going to make sure you have to have 2 batteries that you can swap out while one's being charged and the other. But solar charging is really the best bet if you're going to be using a battery or in a remote area. And they recommend using deep cycle marine batteries for those. So posts and insulators, you can use wood, metal T-posts like this, or fiberglass or plastic. Those are going to kind of come in the electric fencing kits. I'd highly recommend, if possible, using the wood or the metal. Those are going to be far more sturdy, far more durable. Again, a bear is a physical animal. It provides some measure of physical restraint as well. But you are going to have to use insulators for the wood and metal posts. But they're relatively cheap in relation to your overall design. Wire, you can use steel, aluminum, or woven wire. Steel is more durable, harder to work with, doesn't conduct quite as well as the aluminum. So the smaller the number, the larger the diameter of the wire. So for steel, you need 12 to 14 gauge in order for it to be conductive enough to work. For aluminum, 14 gauge or more. I'll talk about single wires, so single strands of wire in the design versus an entire fence panel in a second. But you want to make sure your wires are no more than 8 inches apart or 8 inches off the ground.
Can I ask you on the or more? Does that mean
that would be or down toward small?
Down.
Yeah, right. And these things don't have to be 10 feet tall. 3 or 4 feet is tall enough to prevent anything from trying to get over it. So your grounding rod, your fence won't work if it's not grounded. It's not completing a circuit. So your grounding rod is essential. So recommended, 3/4 inch galvanized steel that prevents rust. You don't want to paint that rod because that will prevent it from conducting electricity. Use a clamp to attach the wires to it. Driven a minimum of 6 feet into the ground. 1 rod for every joule of output of the energizer. If you've got particularly sandy soils, you're probably going to want to have more than 1 grounding rod. Moisture is going to improve conductivity. So if it's dry, we're in a period of drought, you can take a bucket, put a small hole in it so it kind of weeps into the ground, keeps it wet. You can put rock salt around the grounding rod. That'll help with the conductivity there. So this is really important. You're going out and checking your bees on a regular basis. Every time you're going out there, you should be checking to make sure that it's functional. So having a voltmeter that measures that charge, make sure it's at around that 6,000 volt charge and it's reading properly. That ensures you it's working, it's not shorted out, or what have you. So this is the typical single wire, single strand design where you basically have single strands of wire, one on top of the other going around. You've got your fence posts with the insulators on them, 8-inch spacing between all the wires, and then you've got handles so that you can basically disconnect those wires here. All of the wires are connected together, and they're connected to the positive terminal of your fence charger. The negative terminal is connected to your grounding rod. So basically when the bear's here and it touches a wire, the ground surface and the grounding rod complete the circuit and make that charge. You can also put something like chicken wire or fence panels on the ground right next to there. So when the bear stands on those, connect that to the grounding rod in the negative terminal. You'll get that instantaneous completion of the charge there. You want to put your fence charger, it's tough to draw on the diagram, but the solar panel and the fence charger inside Bears are curious. You don't want them just poking around and messing with it and disconnecting or destroying your solar panel there. What we would ideally recommend is using something like this, where you've got livestock, hog panels that you use and you electrify those. You wire those panels together here, and that's what you use. That provides both a physical and an electrical barrier for the bears. And you'll see also your warning sign on there. This is the bait that we'll talk about in a second. Otherwise, just the same, just a different material. You've got to keep your wires or your panels away from the fence post with the insulators, but pretty simple. So this is what that wire panel design would look like. You know, you've got your driven wooden posts, they've got insulators on them. Your panels are electrified here with your charger and solar panel, and you've got a well-protected beehive. I recommend that you electrify the whole panel, but you could also do something like this. It's kind of tough to see, but there's a separate wire that is held out here away from the panels. So that way, if a bear tries to get through or over this fence, it can't help but encounter that single wire there. Just a slightly different design there.
Dave, will the bear's fur insulate them from the electric jolt?
Yep, and so that's why we'll talk about baiting in just a second. So this is what you want. You want to be able to go out there and find that your beehives are there and intact. So you're going to want to warn people. You've got this in your yard, in a neighborhood or something, that you do indeed have electric fencing, so you should have a warning sign on all sides of your fence setup. So this is the baiting. So, like you were saying, a bear is intentionally breaking into a beehive right now to get at that food. So it's going to be stung how many times, and half of those it doesn't feel. So you want it to really feel that charge. If you've got a 400-pound bear and it takes that wire in the chest, it may or may not do anything for it. So what you want is that bear's nose to touch that wire. It's going to get that zap right in the face, and it's going to learn a lesson in a real hurry. So you can just take a piece of aluminum and you kind of make a little tent with it. Put some bacon grease or peanut butter on the underside of that, and that's going to draw the bear's nose right to there. I've seen other people, here's just bacon, just twisted around the wire. Again, going to take the nose right there. I've heard people talk about putting tuna cans or something on there, something that conducts and is going to draw the bear's nose into that wire. Our Valley District biologist, who has 30 plus years of bear experience, thinks this is really the most important aspect, is making sure you're baiting the bear's face right into those wires. So vegetation maintenance, vegetation, whether it's grass underneath or shrubs from the side, can short your fence out. So they're going to draw down your battery, and then when the bear goes to touch it, it's not going to get a zap. So you need to maintain the vegetation, whether it's with weed mat, you can spray. You probably don't want to do that around your bees, but you need to do something to keep the vegetation from coming up and touching those bottom wires. You want to make sure that you have adequate spacing between the fence. You don't want to have your hives right up here 6 inches, because I'm a bear, I can reach right through and I can destroy your hives without even getting inside. So you want to make sure there's adequate spacing between the electrified fence and the hives so that the bear can't cause damage from the outside. You'll be able to go to your feed store and just find, these nice nest sit-ups. They are nice and convenient. And they probably will keep out a bear that size. That's a Massachusetts male black bear. It's certainly not as sturdy, as secure a fence as some of those other designs. If you are taking your hives and you're putting them out in a field or an orchard somewhere, for a temporary setup, those might be something that are adequate for a short period of time. If you're taking your hives out to a field and you're taking them every year, you might just build a fence there, and then you can remove your charger and those kind of things in the off season when you don't have it out there. But certainly would recommend the more permanent designs, because you see these things can be flattened. If you are going to use these, I'd highly recommend you add additional fence posts, between here, so that there's extra rigidity there. Make sure it's as tight as possible. And do make regular maintenance on it, so it doesn't get to this point where it's collapsed and not providing a nice adequate barrier for you. And this is really important. each one of you has the decision whether or not you want to use electric fencing. But if a bear is accessing one of your hives, it's going to make that electric fencing less effective for someone else. Once it learns that food reward that it's getting, it's more likely to go through someone else's electric fencing than if everyone is using electric fencing. So I highly recommend that as you're at meetings, conventions, you spread the word and you get your whole community to be using electric fence. I can't say it enough. You do not want to bait bears to where your hives are. So if you have beehives in your backyard, you're crazy if you have bird feeders as well. Essentially, you're drawing those in. You're providing another food source there. And it won't be, oh, the bear's going to feed at the bird feeder. He'll leave my hives alone. No, he's going to empty your bird feeder, and then he's still hungry, and he's going to destroy your
You
hives.
might make granola with a bird seeding it.
What was that? With granola? Yeah. So, I mean, you really want to make sure your property is cleaned up and you don't have other food sources there that are going to attract the bear. Again, this is your goal. So, it really is in your best interest to develop the best fence design you possibly can. Because you want to be happy and come out here and see that your bees are intact each time. So that's kind of it. That's our website. Again, you can find that electric fencing guide there. Lots of other information on bears. And so I'd be happy to take any questions if there's still a minute or two.
What are the commercial guys doing where they get different, lot larger scope to protect? How's that working?
So I think that's where you have to have like a larger charger. You can still build a pretty big fence. You're just going to have a more impressive electrical charger that will actually send a charge through a much larger perimeter of fence.
M16 with night vision.
And there is some of that as well.
Black bears aren't necessarily black either. Don't they sometimes are brown?
Ours predominantly are. We don't. Okay. They can be brown phased, but we don't really have it. A lot of ours will have a blonde chest blaze, but we really don't have any brown ones in Massachusetts.
How many bears have you tagged in Massachusetts?
We are at 488 right now.
So that's about a third of the population?
No. So that is over the years. Right now we have 28 tagged. So for us, the difficulty is just capturing bears. We just have limited resources to do so. So 28 is actually kind of our high point for the recent history. So at any one point, we don't have that many. We estimate there's somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 bears in the state at this point.
Anything east of 128?
No.
Well, Newton, you said. Yeah.
Well, but yeah, that was kind of, it wandered in there and it was moved out of there. So.
They had a piece on the news tonight. There was a bear attack out in Agawam. There was a dog that was attacked. And what do they do? Do they kill that bear if that happens?
Not likely. And so I haven't even gotten a phone call on that today. And unfortunately, that is one of the risks. And dogs can be one of those triggers that, more often than not, it is the dog being aggressive to the bear. You let it outside, particularly small dogs go absolutely crazy, and the bear acts defensively. We don't have bears regularly going after dogs in the state. Coyotes are far more likely to take a dog than a bear is. If that had been a person, then yes, that would be a bear that we would go after and try to remove.
So bears are porcine, I guess, and you referred to the female as a sow.
Yes.
What's the term for the male one?
Boar.
Boar, yeah.
Are there people that specialize in doing those fences that you can hire?
There are problem animal control agents. I don't know if any of them will do it. I imagine they would. I just don't think that's something that necessarily regularly comes up.
I'm just thinking, how am I going to do that?
Right, and so that guide that I put together literally provides, step-by-step directions of how to do it. But I'm sure there are more contractor companies, and then they could use the guide and put it together pretty easily. It's really was supposed to be designed so that if you could read it, it's like, all right, step one, put the post in the ground, to be as straightforward as possible.
Hanson Feed and Grain sells the stuff. They'll probably give you instructions too. They're not hard to build.
So you probably wanna give us an idea of the pricing for all of this, like, you know, what we're.
Yeah,
There's a beekeeper for you.
in reality, I don't know exactly. I think the most expensive part is going to be the charger. And I think you can get one that for a couple $100, like $100 to $200, depending. And then it's just the rest of the materials, you know, aren't that you can buy a 6-foot T-post at Home Depot for $6 a piece. You know, maybe you need 8 of them around there. The insulators are cheap, you know, so altogether it's going to be a couple $100, but it's not going to, you know, it should pay for itself in one damaged beehive in reality.
I just say something. I just threw a Google search up, and I said electric fence installers, Massachusetts. A lot of the dogs come up, but there's a guy down the Cape that's in here, and that for bear specifically. Well, he's in Yarmouth, and then there's South Shore.
He's got a racket.
South Shore Handyman.
Yeah, no kidding.
So South Shore Handyman, you could probably buy the stuff and hire a handyman to come in and install it if you can't do it yourself. You know, have him come in and do it. It's not hard, right? I mean, we did it.
Well, I
up in
think
Maine.
fence builders should be well versed in building any kind of fence.
Yeah, but they're not
You're just gonna
necessarily
pay
gonna-
through the nose, though.
Yeah,
let me tell you-
certainly. If you're going to pay for anybody to do it for you,
Well,
you're gonna
that's
pay
why
for
a
themselves.
handyman, if you hand him the materials,
Sure.
I think he's gonna be a little bit, and plus he might have some electrical knowledge and he'll be able to work things. And a guy who puts post and rail fences up, first of all, they're really expensive. I just priced
I know.
that out.
Fences are not.
Oh my God. And then the other side, you know, I don't think they have the knowledge. Yes, Chuck.
And real quick question, have you and Greg experienced bear?
Oh, we had fun with the bear.
Fun with bear?
It was wonderful, yeah. And as a matter of fact, I'm afraid this one's gonna run off the back porch and chase the bear. I'm saying, don't go out there. And he's like, I'm not going to. But the bear the hives got too tall and they were too close to the fence. Really good flow. And he picked, I'll never forget this. He picked 2 of those supers up, stood up on his hind legs, looked right at us, his eyes were this wide, and walked into the woods. What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do?
Ranger ain't gonna like this, Elodie.
So needless to say, we don't have bees up in Maine right now.
Well, the reason he reached over
He reached
and
over
grabbed
the
it and
fence.
pulled him over
Yeah,
because
he pulled
bears are
him over.
problem solvers.
Yep.
Oh, yeah, they figure it out.
They're very smart,
Very
and that's
smart.
why we make, you know,
So
the
he-
recommendation, you know, of this type of spacing.
I
Yes.
probably want 6 or 8 feet so I could have room for a table so I can put my hives on it. when I'm
So
playing
did
with
they
the
know it was an electric fence? I mean, how do you?
And you know
He
something?
saw the sign that said electric fence.
And he said, "Oh, I'm not gonna touch it. I'm just gonna pull it
Graduated
over."
first grade.
And that's what he did. He just pulled it
I
over.
believe it.
But he
So-
didn't get the
Over the
whole,
fence.
he could have
He
got
couldn't
the
got
whole.
no, he didn't get the bottom. He got the top, the honey. And the next morning, I was outside walking around with gloves on, picking up handfuls of bees. The poor things. They didn't know what the hell had hit them. And there she was. The hive did not make it, but I did find the queen. We put them all back in, but they didn't make it. It was too late in the year. Remember?
Yeah.
It was late August, wasn't it?
But we baited with sardine cans,
Yeah.
we put nail holes in it,
Yep.
and then the aluminum foil with peanut butter, and we made the fence higher, and it came back and it got zapped, and it left some bear scat.
It sure did, and it was
Yep.
bare distance
Get the
away.
scat out.
Go on to Google. You know, there's different designs that will walk you through how to build one right on YouTube. Some of the we tried to screen out a lot of the recommendations in our guide, so we kind of have it just the way we really want you to be doing it. So be careful what you see on the internet, but you can see how well these work. There are videos that show bears being zapped, and it is very effective.
How many volts will it take to get them to medium rare?
We'll find out.
So,
Is that your pacemaker?
Kenny, turn that thing down.
So we only have black bears in Massachusetts.
Correct.
What about Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire?
Yeah, the closest brown bears are in Wyoming, Montana. So there's nothing in here. No.
What about the bears in Middleborough? There was reports of
In Carver.
years back of
They wander
they
through.
were
There was a
following
bear
down
read
the power lines or something.
Yeah, and so generally when they wander into one of the more eastern towns, it tends to be they follow a natural corridor. So they can very quickly, you know, a bear can move multiple towns in a day. And so they'll follow some greenway and all of a sudden they're 2 towns over, or they get into a much more developed area pretty quickly.
Wasn't that the Cape Bear?
The take bear, yeah.
So that very well may have been. So that bear, we could track, by the reports as it wandered its way through. And
The Cape Bear, yeah.
Swim.
So during the summer, do they kind of live in? Do they stay in one place and have a center, or do they range around?
it's kind of constant movement. So they'll cover their whole range. They on a weekly. Pretty weekly basis, they'll do repeated loops. They can concentrate in an area for a short period of time if there's a reliable food source. They will spend, more than just a day in an area. They can spend a week or so in an area, but generally they're moving around pretty constantly.
As opposed to during the winter when they're more centralized.
Yeah, most of the time in the winter they're dens, so they're at one physical spot. But we've also had some of our bears that don't den. Again, it's an adaptation to food shortage. So if you've got a lot of bird feeders in the town, they don't necessarily always den because there's reliable food all winter.
So Dave, I'm in my house, my wife's in the house, the dog's in the house. We look out and there's a bear trotting around the yard.
Leave it.
Yeah. Just stay
Let
in the
it
house.
stay in the house. Don't try to get closer. Don't try to take a picture. I don't. If you had a coyote you had in the yard and you were having issues, I tell you to chase the thing, physically chase it right out of the yard, yelling and screaming like a crazy person, but drive it out of the yard. I don't want you getting that close to the bear. There's no reason to put yourself in a situation where all of a sudden the bear wants to defend its food source.
Should you call anybody? Is it an emergency, or call somebody for information?
Yeah, you can call someone for information, but really the advice you're going to get is that same advice. Leave the bear alone. It'll wander on. After it's gone, make sure you don't have any food sources for it to return to.
Bears can run faster than people.
What about growing food crops? Blueberries and...
Yep, people are doing it all over the state. The important thing is that if you say you have an apple tree and in the fall the apples start falling on the ground, clean them up. Just don't allow them to sit on the ground and rot. If you've got a lot of berry patches, be alert as you're going out there, just to make sure there's not a bear in your fruit patch. But yeah, I don't want to prevent you, say, you can't do these activities. You definitely still can, but just, try to make it as clean as possible.
Yeah.
And the bear starts chasing you.
And wear a bear belt.
No, the bear starts chasing you. Just make sure you have somebody else with you that runs slower than you.
So I have a question. Has anybody had any problems with bears in the beehives down here?
No.
No, you're still in the safe zone. But like I said, last year, someone in Weston, so right on 128, and that's not really our established range, bunnies. It was even outside of our expansion range. Hit beehives there. So even, it would just take one animal. There was a bear in Rentham. It could very quickly move over 2 towns, 3 towns, and all of a sudden, the eastern edge of the county anyways, you could have bears there. And that one bear can cause damage while it's in town. So, you're definitely not there yet. But if you start hearing reports of bears around town or in the general area, you're certainly going to want to start taking precautions. Or if you're moving remote hives further west, if you're setting up in fields or something and you're traveling some distance to do it, you'd want to make sure you took adequate protections there.
So that's sort of a segue into my question. Are there any projections on, when they are going to be more common around the coast?
Yep, and so it's up to the females. So the females don't expand as quickly as the males. The males, again, he could move 7 towns over as he disperses as a yearling. The females can occupy a portion of her mom's range. So right now they butt up to Interstate 190 and they're not quickly jumping over that. Eventually a female is going to move through and she's past that next barrier. She's now going to reproduce in there and the population starts to increase in that area relatively quickly. So it's kind of as the females broach those various barriers, they will start expanding. So the bear population in central Massachusetts is at that point now where it's starting to increase rapidly the way it had in western Mass 20, 30 years ago.
What is rapid? Is it a generation from now in 20 years?
In 20 years, if it was on the same growth pattern, we would have very high densities of bears from Worcester west. Yep. But you would also now have bears where this area would be remember I showed how it jumped the Connecticut River eventually and started to spread? That's in 20 years, if we didn't check the population in some other way, that's what you'd be having in this area.
Don't we also have them coming up for Rhode Island?
Rhode Island's still kind of the same thing, where they occasionally get a bear that wanders through from Mass, but they really don't think they have a resident population at this point.
So is population saturation involved in pushing the pushing it east?
Yep. Yeah. So essentially, it's moving into unoccupied range where they don't have to compete because there's
For
a
resources.
ton. If you go look in that 495 corridor, there's still between 128 and 495. There is a ton of wild habitat. There is a lot of places that bears could live in that area. So the potential certainly is there.
Do noisemakers such as fireworks have any effect on the bears?
It might, the first time it might run one off, but they tend to return. It tends to be a very temporary solution.
Hunting as a mitigation factor. We've got the white-tailed deer in Massachusetts just exploding because not enough people, they're breeding and hunters aren't taking them.
Right.
Are we going to run into the same situation
So
here?
we do have a regulated hunting season with bears, but we have throughout this entire period where the population has been growing. So essentially, we don't take enough bears in our hunting season now to limit the population.
So
growth.
it's similar to the whitetail. We
Right.
don't take
So-
enough of them
so
to
we-
keep the population
exactly.
in check.
Right.
It's still closed after 50 bears that are tagged?
No.
or it's-
Nope. So we have it's essentially unlimited. We sold 17,000 bear permits last year, and we only took 270 bears. So it's not a matter of permits. Yeah. So the ballot initiative in 1996 that restricted traps also made bait and the use of hounds illegal. So that decreases. So basically, you just have to go out in the woods and hope a bear wanders by. So that decreases the success rate for hunters. A couple of years ago, 3 years ago, we did expand our hunting season into the deer shotgun season, and that has been effective for taking some bears because you have a lot of hunters out in the woods, and so you have a greater chance of people encountering a bear at that time. But the shotgun season occurs after half of our females are already in the den, and so it's limited. So we may consider expanding we likely will consider expanding our bear season again in the future.
One bear per person?
Right now, yes.
What do you do with the bear after you've shot it?
People eat it.
You've got it.
Yeah.
And you hang it for a few days.
Yes, no, people definitely do, just like deer, they eat bear meat, so.
Absolutely, it was very good.
Okay, so that slide that you had of, I think the Northampton area where you had all those yellow dots in the one generalized area that seemed to have a periphery around it. Did that bear have a den in that area and that was considered its territory?
So there was some of the wetlands. No, this is not the right one. So it may have been in Hatfield. Where they're using oxbow wetlands. So was it this one you were referring to?
Yeah, it doesn't look like that bear's going like beyond those boundaries.
Like this, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, so no, they have home ranges that they'll use. So that is a territory that they'll establish, and that generally, it can shift a little bit year to year, but generally, she knows where the resources are in that area, and that's where she's going to go to find food and whatnot.
So she's hibernating there in that area.
Yeah, so this bear actually, this is one of the off-ramps for Interstate 91. There's a culvert that goes underneath here. Every time she has yearling cubs, she dens in that culvert. One of her yearlings denned between the off-ramp, the overpass, and 91 one year, just in a little bit of vegetation. So they can den almost anywhere. But she's denned in multiple places throughout here over the years.
How often do they have cubs?
Every other year.
How territorial are the females? Will another female move into there, or will they share?
Yep. So there's considerable overlap of home ranges. And quite often there's some relationship amongst a lot of those bears. Like I said, the cubs, the female cubs will occupy a portion of their mother's home range. So it could be the mother a daughter from 1 year and a daughter from 2 years later, are using some portion of the range, but they're not, aggressively territorial where they're defending. As long as there's sufficient resources, they're not really actively defending a territory.
How about the males?
The males don't either. They will compete during the mating season, so there definitely will be battles at that time. But again, they're not. That's really the one time a year where there's going to be conflict, if you will.
The use of GPS now, I'm sure you know where every possible den is in that area. Is it your intention to monitor them, or if they start to misbehave, relocating them to a more rural area?
There's nowhere in Massachusetts that I can relocate a bear to that it won't be a problem for someone else.
Okay.
So if there was a bear that we deemed to be a nuisance that needed to be removed, it would be lethally removed. But that's not something we do very often at all. It's, if it's literally breaking into homes or has attacked someone or something, that would be where we would go to that extent. For being in yards and bird feeders and causing property damage, that's not something where we're going to go out and actively try to remove that animal.
What determines the difference between them being bears and being suddenly becoming aggressive? Do they get rabies or?
No, and again, they generally don't tend to be aggressive. Even a bear that's breaking into a house is generally just doing it to try to find food. So that's kind of where, again, I was talking before, how the behavior can escalate over time. Just feeding in a bird feeder in a backyard, and then it's spending more time on decks and things, getting more comfortable there, and then all of a sudden it's looking into outbuildings and something, and then eventually a bear may break into a house or something. It doesn't happen very often, but it can happen. But again, they still don't tend to be aggressive, so it's not in inherent aggressiveness that there is. It's just their boldness to access food increases.
And they'll defend their cubs too.
Yeah, they will, but I not to the extent that people think. That a female with cubs is this terror. Like I said, all those dots were females, or the vast majority were females, and they're living amongst people all the time, and they're not being aggressive towards people.
So, say for example you had a place that was a fair distance away, say like 4 hours, and it could be far, like say in New York State, the Adirondack Park or something like that. Would you consider this equipment to be reliable and durable enough that you could say not visit it for like a month and still feel confident that it's not malfunctioning and still working?
I would certainly be more comfortable than not having any electric fencing there. So the issues you're going to have with something like that are probably your vegetation control. So you probably want to make sure you had adequate weed mat or something underneath there to really keep the vegetation down so it's not shorting out your battery. Make sure your solar charger was, if that's what you were using, was a really good one and everything was set up right. You just run the risk of a short or something causing the system to fail. So otherwise, yeah, I would say probably, but the Adirondacks may not be the best place because they tend to have a lot of nuisance bears up that way. So
They actually have a small windmill at the charges too, so if you're worried about not getting enough sun, there's a lot of places that get wind.
You could have a backup.
No matter what, so you have the wind backup, and it charges your batteries at night also.
Now we're talking $1,000, right?
No, they're not really that bad. Not really that bad at all. And it's great if you have a cabin, because now you're getting battery backup for your lights in your cabin.
Snow is bad for solar.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Well, if it's snowing, wouldn't the bears mostly be in the den?
It really depends, unfortunately. I mean, they can, the females that are pregnant will den like clockwork on November 1st. Females with yearling cubs, sometime generally later November, December, males same. But if there's food available, maybe not at all.
If you're feeding your birds all winter.
Yep.
Any more questions? Well, thank you very much.